let's come to Vision 11 in 2 weeks with a vision today at Vision 9. We're looking to acquaint ourselves with something that is new. We're dealing with 4 forms and 4 processes. And these 8 together constitute a new way of learning. But they're consistent with the very ancient past, so that once we do learn how to mature ourselves this way, we will be able to look at any development of human beings on the planet, including the future, and it will make sense to us. We will be able to understand how they learned. Even though we have learned in a different way, our learning will always be able to ratio itself with their learning. So that this is an education that permanently cures prejudice, permanently erases intolerance, and is indefinitely refinable. You can learn forever and increase your scale and not distort what you already have done. Now, it's taken about 40 years to do this because it couldn't be planned out. It's much too complex to plan. And so it had to be done in a very special way. It had to be done as you do it, and you keep improving it. But because it was such a large thing as it grew, it was more and more difficult to keep it within the compass of reasonable duration. And it takes 2 years because it's the annual cycle of something that helps us mature. We mature on the basis of time cycles. There are in the body circadian rhythms that are there for different times: daily, weekly, bi-weekly, monthly. Learning is an annual cycle, and that's why all ceremonial years were the stuff out of which culture was made. There were always spring festivals, there were midsummer festivals, there were harvest festivals, there were midwinter festivals. And at various times, all of the cultures and all of the civilizations on this planet have observed that. This learning observes that. But in order to give ourselves an angle of comparison and a ratio of proportion and a way to contrast that takes us out of the natural order but doesn't divorce us from it, we have a paired annual cycle, 2 years. The 4 forms are easy as a mnemonic to keep track of. They're traditional: body, mind, spirit, and the 4th form is the universe as a whole. But we call them here by the phase name that establishes them. And the body is established by ritual comportment. Just as the mind is established by symbols, symbolic comportment. The spirit is actually a person. Our person is a spirit, is actually a work of art, and so that phase is called art rather than spirit, or rather than personality or person. Art. and we'll see how appropriate that is. And for the universe as a whole, the phase that establishes that is science. And it's important to understand that science is about the cosmos, not the universe. The idea of the universe is a symbolic, mental idea. It belongs in symbols. The universe is actually a symbolic idea. But the cosmos is a scientific objectivity, and the difference is that an idea in the mind will always follow an integral mode of operating and seek to make a structure which is integral in the mind, and that's why it would be called the universe by the mind. One place, uni. But we're going to see that there are two kinds of forms that are integral, but there are two kinds of forms that are differential. They have a different mode. They don't bring together, but they open up. Just like two processes are integral, they bring together. But the other two processes are differential. They open up. And it's in order to appreciate the difficulties of the past, the immaturities that were built in by the flaws of learning, that most of the structures that our species made larger than a tribal level have not worked. Most social orders, larger than a small group of people who inhabit the same geographical valley and who have cultural traditions going back forever, united through annual year rituals, through a shared mythology, and have very similar minds. All such human groups, whatever they called themselves, their name usually translates as the people. The people. We are the people. At the end of the film Grapes of Wrath, the old mother of the Okies, played by Jane Darwell, says to her young son, Henry Fonda, who's going out to try and find out what's going on in the world. She said, well, other people can fail, but we can't, because we're the people. We are the people. We're what counts. For the last 10,000 years, men and women like ourselves have come to understand that they can tame animals. They can tame plants. They can tame the minerals and bring them into play in such a way that you don't have to be a nomad to follow the animals. You can now raise them, domesticate them. You can domesticate the plants. You can learn about the mineral world, and you can make your medicines or your paints. Now that capacity to do that has been here for a very, very long time. When there was an analysis of the paints used at Lascaux 17,000 years ago, a modern chemical analysis of the paints that they used showed that they were very sophisticated, that they involved at least 3 steps beyond the natural deposits, which makes it a technology. The color that was used at Lascaux to make the black or the red or the yellow, they thought that it must have been just simple deposits that were ground up and then mixed with water, and that was it. Those paints were manufactured by taking the raw materials. For instance, if you take calcite from a stalactite in a cave and you heat that, if you can heat that to 400 degrees, you will make a kind of a base that you will be able to then start to get color out of. But if you add a little bit of special clay that has another calcium quality to it, and then you reheat that powder and that clay together up to 1,000 degrees, you get a kind of deep color then that, when mixed with water, makes an indelible application. If you use a kind of a thick stamping initially, and then you take the hairs of an animal and make a brush, you can work with that stamped, thrice heated, thrice changed natural ingredient, and you can make colors that will stay on the rock wall. In the case of Lascaux, they've been there for 17,000 years. The four forms are ritual, symbol, art, and science. And the four processes are nature, myth, vision, and history. And it's important because if we have this phase quality, if we abstract those four forms together, we can hold them in a symbolic figure in our mind, and I'm going to give it the name of a diamond because it is very much like a jewel in that it needs to be cut along its facets to bring out its brilliance. The diamond of the four forms is matched by the diamond of the four processes. And it's important. A process is not objective, but is something that occurs, something that happens. The objectivity is there because there is a structure that is able to be cinched out of the process into a very special relationship. It's like the Paleolithic artist learning that you can't just take things naturally, but you have to work with them to refine them and to bring them into relationship with something else and put it into another process other than nature, and then you get something else, something different. So that symbol forms really don't come out of nature. Symbol forms come out of the process that we call the phase of myth, which establishes, not as something, but establishes the process, the occurrence of experience. And experience is the flow of images, of feelings, the flow of language. So that experience is not an objective thing, it's not a form, but is a process that is very similar to nature. So that experience can be brought not just into sync with nature, but into a participation so that the flow of nature and the flow of experience occur together. And when they occur together, the objectivity that comes out of nature and the objectivity that comes out of experience have an alignment. They coincide. So that the body that comes out of nature aligns itself with the mind that comes out of experience. It was very simple to say it that way. What is difficult to keep track of is that while that is occurring and happening, if we don't distinguish for ourselves these different phases, we immediately are not only going to lose track of distinctiveness, but the mind co-opts the entire situation as it naturally would, as an integral idea, and the mind then assumes that it knows. Whereas the true perspective is that the mind is 1/4 of the ecology of the integral as a whole. And so the mind has to learn, in its perspective, it needs to cooperate. It needs to have a perspective that it can align with the body, but that in order for that alignment to occur, the experience, that is the context out of which one's ideas come, one's symbols come, needs to be in a participatory sync with nature. And said this way, it sounds so sophomoric, so simple. And in traditional times, it was very simple. In tribal cultural life, for hundreds of thousands of years, our kind had no problems whatsoever. But no problems whatsoever because the mind, the symbol aspect, was not developed spectacularly well. Just well enough to function and operate. But as soon as vision comes into play, vision is a third process. It isn't nature, and it isn't experience. We call it today consciousness. And what is peculiar about consciousness is that it does not participate with nature in the same way that experience can participate with nature. When consciousness, as a process, comes into play with nature, it weaves. Rather than participates, it weaves. And you begin to get a very complex process then, that you could say is conscious nature. And this conscious nature is one that always changes the changing, but changes it in the way that instead of nature just being natural, it now has a magical quality to it. It becomes supernatural, actually supernatural. And so all human beings, up until very recent times, civilized times, starting about 2,500 years ago, were sophisticated enough by that time to understand that there was a real problem here, that assuming that consciousness works along with nature and experience proved to be disastrous, because once the mind becomes powerful enough to have comprehensive ideas and transforms of consciousness strong enough not just to make works of art, but really big, powerful works of art. At the same time, those capacities of differential form that go into making really spectacular, strong works of art also make very strong persons. Persons who are larger than life, we say. Charismatic persons are one thing, but someone who is spiritually, artistically, differentially energized is enormously powerful, more than one could imagine. And such people now, through their energizing, make a fourth process called history. And once history comes into play as a process, it wants to weave, just like consciousness wants to weave, with the processes of nature and with the processes of experience. But history is so much more developed differentially than just vision, that one runs into a problem right away. And the problem doesn't become really visible until you use our phases. Those four form phases, those four process phases, give us a way to understand that when they work together, no more than 4 phases occur together in one's attention. It's like a frame of attention. I call it a square of attention, because that's the natural order. Once you have, like the 4 seasons or the 4 corners, once you have that square of attention, Our natural attentiveness looks through that frame. When consciousness comes into play, it joins in a very special way that square of attention, that frame. It occupies the place that nature occupied originally. So that now one has a different square of attention for the very first time in the history of the world. Someone has awakened consciously and is now not just nature, ritual, myth, and symbol, but the base is now ritual, and it extends all the way to vision. And so a visionary is in initially a very precarious, perilous position, because they will occur to themselves as being supernatural, as being outside of the natural concourse, as of being a magical being who can do special things. And this magical being prefers now a new kind of a form, a kind of a magical art form like the personal spirit. And that this then, when it comes into play, takes the place of the ritual comportment. So that when art comes into play, ritual goes out of the square of attention. Just as when vision comes into play, nature goes out of the square of attention. When art comes into really strong play, ritual goes out, so that art and ritual are antithetical in a way to one's attentiveness. It isn't that it disappears or goes unconscious, but it goes into a subconscious context that's not there in one's attention. It's peripherally there, but it's peripherally there as like a background, as a context, and not what one is attending to. And so artists, the better artists they are, the less ritual they include in their attentiveness. They replace ritual with art. And art having a very special quality to it. Forms of art are distinct from forms of ritual in precisely this way. Ritual forms are always pragmatic. They're what you do. The action steps of what you do in this limited sequence will produce such and such an objective result. But art forms are not pragmatic, they are prismatic. They, like a prism, will open up a whole spectrum so that instead of existence being objective pragmatically, it is now differentially objective prismatically. And one gets a very different sense of form for the first time. So that the discovery of art is always a personal awakening. It comes out of one's conscious vision. It comes out of one's process of being supernatural. And in a way, the first artists were always the greater magicians. One reason of taking Shakespeare at this point in our learning is that he was one of the most refined persons perhaps ever to live on the planet. And towards the end of his working life, the last play that he worked on is one of the most miraculous productions of art ever done. It's so refined. It's called The Tempest. And it wasn't published until 1623. Shakespeare died in 1616, but his wife, Anne Hathaway, lived on until 1623. And in honor of her getting ready to pass on, in honor of her husband, all of the great friends of Shakespeare who were still alive got together, and they put together what is called the First Folio. They printed it up beautifully, and they would take all of his great plays from acting editions Actors, in order to prepare, always will have little roles that have their roles on with the cues. And they'll be able to take these pages or these scrolls around and develop their lines and so forth. But for a reader who needs to read the play, like somebody who is not the author, a director, will have to have a quarto. We'll have to have some way to keep track of all the different parts, all the different action. Almost all of Shakespeare's plays, except The Tempest, were in quarto editions. It never appeared in a quarto edition. It wasn't published until 1623 in the first folio. It is about magic. It is about the magic of reconciliation of what were irreconcilable polarities in a previous generation. And that previous generation could never have reconciled these difficulties, these polarities, because they had been built in to a life so long and so established they were like the grains of wood, and meeting means that you're cutting cross grain. What allowed the next generation to reconcile it was that two individuals from opposite sides of the previous generation fell in love, and through their love were able to envision a different life, a new life for themselves, one that was completely transformed outside of the previous limiting conditions, so that there is an art of interpersonal coming together, as well as the personal art of differential forms. And on that level, when two human beings achieve an interpersonal differential, their spectrums illuminate each other in such a way that they now have a very special kind of interaction. Their interaction now produces not just a rainbow spectrum, but makes a differential diffraction pattern as well. And so you get a diffracting rainbow for the very first time, which means now that the realm of possibilities is not just rainbowed, but is now diffractible in the sense that it will produce a kind of sizzling quality of scintillation, scintillating. It's no accident that when you're working with nuclear energies and research, the plastic, that special plastic that is used is called scintillator, that it allows photons to go through it without any interruption whatsoever. The quality that comes out is a magical relationship. Magical because there is now a possibility of them sharing vision and sharing their persons. Now, this is a very ancient understanding of it, and it amounts to this. They have centers that are able to exchange with each other, so that the one center operates in the other, and that other center operates in them, at the same time that they have their original centers. So that they have now not just a sense of differential person, quite advanced beyond the integral mind, but they now have a movable, ratioable, scintillating quality of person. It is this quality that generates the energies that come out as history. So that we will see that history is an enormously high-powered process. It is so high-powered that if the mind tries to grasp history by itself, it cannot do it. And so it seeks to commandeer the historical process under its aegis And then instead of having history as a process, what you have is a mind that is inflated and ideologically projects itself in place of history. And when history is not allowed to participate, the previous phase that history has replaced in the square of attention gains surreal, inordinate emphasis. And that process is myth. So that the egotistical mind not only forbids the development of personal and interpersonal history, but by its inflation and its regression and its projection, it sabotages the base of experience. And when it does so, the mind that has done this sabotaging finds that it is fully justified because now its experience is so skewed that it justifies one having this kind of mind. At this point, one has the development of the ego in an egotistical sense. That's how it happens. That's how it occurs. It's like a knot is tied, and the self-serving mind now has co-opted its own experiential base. And when it does this, it lacks only one ingredient to have its own empire. And that one ingredient is that it must now go down and co-opt the body. It has to co-opt ritual. And not just its ritual, everyone else's ritual. Everyone must conform. And it's this push of conformity that always meets with self-sabotaging, because one simply can't make everyone mulch, goose step together. It never is going to happen. The Nazis could make tens of millions of people goose step, but there were hundreds of millions of people who said no. The current president wants to have everyone going in democratic ways around the world, and about 3/4 of the world is saying, in our own way, when we get there. It is not for you to inculcate us with your idea. Shakespeare's Tempest was written at a time when you were killed for your religious beliefs. The Catholics and Protestants had reached an impasse in many places, and the place that it was exacerbated was England under Elizabeth I, under Queen Elizabeth. Shakespeare's family were Catholics, but couldn't make a big deal out of it. And so Shakespeare grew up being told and cautioned all the time that you must be alert, that you can't just be natural. You have to keep half an eye and keep your ears cocked, because several of his relatives were killed when he was a boy. His mother's family were called Arden. There's a collection of Shakespeare's play called The Arden Shakespeare. So he grew up in a family where there was always this kind of doubling, ironical, paradoxical quality to life. His father became very successful. At one time was the mayor of Stratford on Avon. And from time to time, there were acting troupes that would travel around England in caravans. And when Shakespeare was a little over 5 years old, is the first time he ever saw one of these traveling companies coming from London. But they were very primitive plays, pre-Elizabethan plays, still medieval, like medieval skits rather than plays. It wasn't until one of the most brash Cambridge intellectuals, Christopher Marlowe, wrote a play called Tamburlaine in 1587. Marlowe was gay, and he was brilliant. He was one of the most learned scholars in Cambridge, and his play Tamburlaine, when it came out, stunned everyone, and they started to make money because people wanted to see it over and over again. And so he followed it up with the second part. And then he got the idea that he would use his university learning, and so he wrote a play called Dr. Faustus about witchcraft and Christianity right in the midst of this Catholic-Protestant war with each other, but it timed it because Marlowe was very, very smart. He was brilliant. He timed it so that the play would be played to celebrate the English victory over the Spanish Armada in 1588. And so when it was played in 1589, it was played up as a festive play to celebrate it wasn't just that the Spanish Armada was beaten, but it was that England from then on was the increasing master of the world. England rules the waves because the Spanish power of maritime superiority was vanquished forever. And from 1590 on, you see English sea power increasingly the mastery of the entire world. Shakespeare came into play writing exactly at this time as a young man in London. And what he did was to find themes of persons in history that were extraordinary to show and reflect prismatically, not pragmatically, but prismatically, the conundrums of the age. And one of his first plays was called Pericles, the master of classical Greece, of classical Athens, the builder of the Parthenon. Later, towards what would be the end of his life, he rewrote Pericles, trying to get the super intense reconciliation energies of history going on the stage, and he didn't quite make it. So he wrote a second play to try and do this, and he chose an ancient English king, Cymbeline, and didn't quite make it. So he wrote a third play called The Winter's Tale, which is spectacular, but it is so complex that it becomes at times almost absurd or surreal in its dramatizing. Then he finally got it, and he wrote The Tempest as the fourth try, and it worked perfectly. And The Tempest was presented before King James the First, was one of the most severe, unforgiving people ever to hold a throne. The first time it was acted was November 1st, 1611. November 1st is the morning after Halloween, after All Hallows Eve, when all the evil spirits are abroad. And 1611 Halloween is when the King James version of the Holy Bible came out. And so Shakespeare's Tempest is the festival celebration that we, for the very first time, have a complete Bible in English, not just to show us the New Testament as it really is, not Catholic or Protestant, but ancient, going back to Jesus' times, Jewish times, and we have the Old Testament now. And the core of the Old Testament was not the Torah for them. The core of it was the Psalms of David. And when we come back from a break, we'll see. It is the Psalms that form the context out of which dramatic action was raised to a world-class height in Elizabethan drama. Let's take a break. Let's come back to, we're repositioning everything. And we're doing so because the old orderings failed us. None of them work. And the bad news is that none of them are going to work. And so we had to have everything redone. And we'll have to redo everything. But in order to do so, the first thing is there has to be a population of people who are capable, who can either do it alone if they need to, or with other people if they need to, or larger groups, or even with the planet as a whole, as a single family of man. All that is possible. But in order to do so, we have to remature. We have to have a way to go back and not be caught in the sandpits of the past, in the glitches of the past, in the flaws that are there everywhere. Almost all the genius of the 20th century came up against, again and again, that civilizations are failing because of incommensurate, because of flaws. Not because there isn't good intention, but that road to hell was paved with all those good intentions. It still happened. It's been 50 years since Samuel Beckett produced Waiting for Godot. We live in a world where it's like Waiting for Godot everywhere. There is no Godot, it would never come. Even if aliens from some other star system come here, we will still have to learn. And I can guarantee you they will have to learn as well. This is a way to not universalize learning, but to give it a different basis so that it has every chance to work in two complementarity ways at the same time. One pragmatic, the other prismatic. The conscious ecology needs to be prismatic. It cannot be condensed. It cannot be unified. It goes against its grain. But the pragmatic qualities of nature also have a grain, and they cannot be obviated. The body must live in such a way that it really does emerge existentially and become objectively stable out of the process of nature. And the mind must emerge out of experience. In a very similar way, emerge in the sense that it's not created, it's not made, but it emerges. And doesn't just emerge once, but emerges in a way that we would call now iterative. It happens again and again and again, so that existentiality is vibratory, it's vibrational. It has a frequency. All matter has a frequency. And if you know how to analyze a spectrum, one can tease out of the light of the process what elements are there. This is astronomy, astrophysics does it all the time. We can tell what the composition chemically is of stars in other galaxies. It is very trustworthy. The signature of molecular hydrogen is detectable even 12 billion light years away. It is always exactly that. It registers exactly that way. And we know analytically now that something just as primordially universal as the electron occurs in 3 different varieties. The electron will have so many electron volts in its registry as a physical object constellated out of the dynamic process of nature into an energy form. But the electron is actually quite feeble compared to the next level, the muon, is considerably more powerful than the electron, but nevertheless is an electron as well. And a third state of that, the tau, is a very high energy, super high energy. And it's this way in our maturation as well. Our figuration ritually is a very objective registry in existence. We really do begin there and exist there. But our minds are like the muon. It is a higher energy. It's a higher energy of integral. Symbolic forms are much higher energy than existential forms. But artistic forms, personal spirit forms, are like the tau. They're very, very high energy, enormously capable, and they are not in an integral mode, but in a differential mode, so that their energy doesn't come together so much as it develops the spectrum of possibilities, not just possible states. And this requires then for those forms that they be appreciated by critiques of something that is appropriate to them, of their prismatic qualities. So that a work of art, as we will see, is something that can be appreciated not just for its beauty, but for its prismatic possibilities as well. And this gives us a whole different kind of an aesthetic. We're not just looking at one aspect or several arguing aspects of a work of art, but there is a whole spectrum of millions of possible ways. Many of them will recommend themselves for a majority of people. Some for just one person. It's still within the validity of a prismatic form and the appreciation to have it carried. One could be literally the to flesh out the spectrum. The old way of expressing it is to contrast the categorical imperative of Immanuel Kant with the existential release of someone like Nietzsche. Kant said, before you do something, you must ask yourself, what if everyone did this? Then maybe you better not do this, because if everyone does this. Whereas Nietzsche's release existentially was, I want to ask, what if no one did this? Then the universe will be minus this value. And it may need this value. It may need it only once, but it may be that once that allows for the spectrum to be full enough to achieve its differential wholeness. And so we need not a new society of toleration and of laws, but of generating prismatic possibilities so that we can appreciate each other. That appreciation is a stronger base upon which to base a civilization. But the difficulty is not so much with consciousness and vision. Our kind have dealt with this for a very long time. We've dealt with art long enough, and even though there are periods where it's rather not degenerate, but it's not seen. But history has never been dealt with right. It is a process that has never been mastered. And the first really powerful failure of history was in classical Greece at the time of the pinnacle of classical Greek civilization, at the time of the building of the Parthenon in the age of Pericles. It was such a catastrophic failure that the art form that was made to express at the time the differential form of what had happened was Greek tragedy. But Greek tragedy was such a comprehensive differential art form that it had its complement, almost like its shadow, was objectively real too, and the shadow, very interestingly, because consciousness works this way, the differential shadow of Greek tragedy was Greek comedy. But in the vibratory exchange between tragedy and comedy, there was another pair of possibilities that also blinked into existence, and one of those pairs was history, and the other pair was philosophy. So you have Plato's dialogues and Thucydides' history at the same time you have Greek tragedy and Greek comedy. And those four all go together in the same spectrum of a differential form. And it's like gravity lensing that will split the light of a distant star because of the gravity of a galaxy in between being so strong that the light of the distant star is split into four. It's like the classic Greek mind in the 400s BC split. And the reason why it split was that they were unprepared culturally to hold the powers of history in the very fragile persons, differential persons that they were able to engender. And so they failed. And the failure was graphic. At the time of the building of the Parthenon, Athens and their allies fought a generations-long war with Sparta and their allies, and both sides beggared each other so much by the deaths of so many young men, by the wasting of so much money, that both protagonists, it was a Cold War of classical Greece, both were vanquished. Sparta ended up where it's been for the last 2,300 years. An English classicist once said, standing on the grass weed slopes where Sparta was, you would never have known there was anything here, because it was just like a little village that left no traces. Whereas Athens seems like it must have been the most colossal place at the time. Look at the ruins and everything. They lost the war, and Athens after that became almost negligible in the world. It became like a university town. It had as much oomph as Cambridge, Massachusetts has as in international affairs. Yeah, it's the site of Harvard and MIT, great. The mayor of Cambridge is never asked to deliver ultimatums. Athens became like that. The failure was noticeable poignantly in the creator of Greek tragedy, Aeschylus. His last great plays, they were usually presented in trilogies, with a fourth little play called a satyr play. It's like 3 films together with a little cartoon. And the only play that has survived is the first play of that final trilogy. He wrote it near the end of his life. He lived to be almost 90. And that play that survives is called Prometheus Bound. And Prometheus Bound tells of the most severe fracture, because here they were, classical Greeks, able to build the Parthenon. Their vision of God was still the mythological Zeus, when human capacity had so outgrown the mythology of Greek mythology. And what Prometheus Bound is about is the ultimate challenge to that God, to Zeus, that he is no longer God, that there is a new divinity growing stronger and stronger, and that new divinity is man, man's capacities. Man's historical capacities will outstrip the powers of divine mythology. This is a huge thing. But what Prometheus Bound is about is that the carrier of that news to man is seized by Zeus's henchmen before he can tell that to man. And so he's bound, he's chained. He's chained on a very high, bleak mountain in the Caucasus Mountains to the classical Greeks, the other side of the Black Sea, where the Caucasus was the place of exile. Whenever anyone was really severely exiled, you were exiled there. Because it was a primitive, mountainous terrain in between everything and completely unco-optable. Like the mountains in between Afghanistan and Pakistan, no one will ever conquer those areas. The Caucasus were like that. That's where Prometheus was chained. He was bound. When Shelley, Percy Shelley, who we're taking with Shakespeare, wanted to challenge the entire world, not just the world that was being redone by the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, but he wanted to challenge that entire civilized structure diagonally all the way through all of its layers. He wrote one of the most powerful philosophical dramas ever written, Prometheus Unbound. Let's free Prometheus. So we're going to take Shakespeare's Tempest and Prometheus Unbound by Shelley and hold them together like a tuning fork to help us to get the tone of how conscious vision, when its process is getting ready to let form emerge, the forms of art, the forms of spirit, the forms of person. It's like vision becomes pregnant. It becomes pregnant in such a way that it's ready to not just release and birth this new form, but to give it the iterative energy so that it can maintain itself, so that works of art come out with such high vibrancy that just to behold them dazzles the natural world. Yeah, like that. So that visionary language always speaks of a spirit being so bright that it hurts the eyes to look at them. The skin is radiant. The psychic energy waves are just rolling off them. Not in a dream, not in a projection, but in differential conscious actuality. And we'll see that it's out of that energy that the energies of the process of history come. And so they are such a high energy plasma that history is almost impossible to deal with unless you can let go of the mythological. And if you let go of the mythological out of your frame of reference, it means also you're letting go of culture. And now you're going to have to stay with civilization. The cultures are still there, but they're not in the attention of oneself. Civilization comes into play then. And this is very, very, very difficult, because the base of that square of attention, of history, art, and vision, is symbols, the mind. And if the mind doesn't agree to be a part of that frame of attention, if it seeks to be the whole story, it sabotages that entire attentiveness, and instead of then having a frame by which one measures, engages, and gets perspective, and composes, and sees, you get a distortion that increasingly has to be made up and manufactured by the mind. And so it becomes a very, very bad surrogate for actual experience, for actual feeling, for actual images, and is always confounded by the body. That's why bodies get anxious, they get ill, they get sick. The mind cannot commandeer existence for itself. And so one of the deep themes in Prometheus Bound and Prometheus Unbound is that artificial persons are the key to what is sabotaging man's life. And Shelley wrote Prometheus Unbound in 1820, and it was just 2 years after his wife wrote her little epic called Frankenstein, or the Modern Prometheus. The first edition of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is 1818. This edition is from the Broadview text. It has a lot of critical comment and is very beautifully done. It's printed in Canada, and it's based in Petersboro, Ontario. The relationship of Frankenstein to Prometheus Unbound is one that is essential. Frankenstein is the modern Prometheus that has tried to be manufactured out of dead fragments that are re-energized by lightning, by a man-held electricity, so that man can take the parts of dead things and put them together and use his command of teeming electricity to vitalize it, and thereby he makes an artificial Superman. Frankenstein is supposed to be a Superman. Notice the shift here. The shift is that this mental artificial projection seeks to be the Prometheus, whereas the classical understanding in Aeschylus, and then again in Shelley himself, was that Prometheus is the messenger. He's like a Hermes. He is the messenger of this, but he is not the protagonist. And this was a very ancient truth, always used in vision, always used in consciousness, everywhere on the planet in ancient times. Those who saw the portents were not those who did the interpreting. The interpreters were different from those who were able to see it. Those who were able to see it were the augurs. They would look at the patterns on the sheep's liver. They would look at the patterns of the birds. They would look at the cracks on the oracle bones for the I Ching. They would look at the arrow stalks. But the augurs only establish the visionary field. It is the interpreters then that must bring the mind into play, into that vision. And the mind, when it's brought into play, must not be the same. Otherwise, you get a mixing of the situation. Instead of getting a weaving of the process of consciousness with the form of the mind, you get the mind imagining that it is the form and the process itself, that it's everything itself, which is impossible to do. And so it nominates by a slip of its own ideological stance and assumes that there is a version of itself that controls experience, the ego. Whereas the fact of it is, and you can establish this in 100 different yogas now, 100 different meditations. There are many prayer forms that can establish this. At the center of the human mind, there is an openness, not an ego. There is nothing there but openness. One of the most shocking presentations of this was after the Second World War, when Jean-Paul Sartre wrote a 600 or 700 page book called Being and Nothingness. And there's a chapter in there called The Whole. that modern existential man discovers eventually in a secular way that he has this hole in the center of his mind. And so the existential angst is that he is condemned to be free unless he can fill that hole with images of things. And so the mind tries, by generating all the time, an unceasing television show of its own so that there's something on that screen, so it will not occur to him that it is blank. And that is the source of the phantasmagoria of anxiety. When that came out, it caused such a sensation in the 1940s that there was so much arguing about it. Sartre wrote a little tiny book called The Transcendence of the Ego, which you can still find. But this is something that goes back to not only ancient times, it goes back specifically because the whole purpose of the art form of Greek tragedy is to create on the stage a dramatic presentation where you know that you are going to come to a moment, a glimpse of that impossible, inevitable blank, nothingness, and experience that. And the tragedy is not experiencing it, but the dramatic form that shows you no matter what you do, no matter what you know, you cannot avoid coming there. And it's called the denouement, the moment, the realization that you had no way not to do this, because it is the way in which the integral structure of the mind is made. It is made to be open at the center, because it is through that openness that conscious vision is possible at all. Otherwise, it wouldn't be possible. And the whole medieval idea of the mind as a mirror is to say, well, the mind is an open reflector and shows the world. Well, then the world fills the mirror. So if we just look at the world and at things, then we're all right. Then we have this perfectly mirrored mind. And as we talked last week, the only way to get a mirror is to seal the back of the window, silver it, so that you can't look through it ever again. Why do you think Lewis Carroll wrote a sequel to Alice in Wonderland? Through the looking glass. The mind becomes absurd when it is not open at its center, because then it mistakes its integral structure itself for everything. I am the world. My mind is the complete ideal of everything, and this, of course, is patently faulty. Not only faulty, but fractured. And it's that fracture of assuming that because you have an accurate ability to reflect upon the material world, that then you are real. Actually, what you're just doing is a very simple, egotistical, ritual short circuit. It's Narcissus. You're just showing yourself yourself. Oh, well, and I am everything. All of this was poignant at the time of the development of Greek tragedy and Greek comedy, of history and philosophy. And at the beginning, as we will see when we get to history, Thucydides says, the reason I write this, he was a general in the war for year after year after year, very famous. He lost a big battle to the top Spartan general, and so they threw him out, and he wrote his book, his history on the Peloponnesian War. And he says, knowing what we know now about human beings, this situation will repeat itself forever unless we are able to change ourselves. All human beings who get to this level of sophistication, of powering up a civilization that is strong enough sharp enough, has mind enough to make Parthenons and Greek tragedies and philosophies and histories will come to repeat this pattern. And of course, in the 20th century, we saw the United States and the Soviet Union repeat the Peloponnesian War for almost 2 generations. And if one looks at history, one can find in China, in India, in Arabia, in Europe, in South America, every place that one looks, the same pattern of vignettes happens again and again. George Santayana wrote one time, he said, "We're condemned to repeat history unless we learn." And William James, at his last speech in Stanford University, 1910, just before he died, he delivered a speech, neither victims nor executioners. And he said, "We will have peace when we work as hard for peace as we do for war. Because human beings can have what they want, but they must work for it. And they must learn they have to work together for this. No one can give this. It doesn't happen automatically. What happens automatically is the repeat of the rote, because the ritual base of it is fighting for its existence and maintains itself, and the mind is aligned with that and fights to maintain its ideological stance again and again and again. One runs across this all the time, and part of our learning is to expose ourselves over the 2-year pattern to every conceivable kind of culture and every conceivable kind of civilization, from Jane Goodall's chimpanzees to some science fiction things, to the Chinese, the Indians, every conceivable. At the same time that we're maturing ourselves, we're acquainting ourselves with the entire range of what human beings have already done and already have gleaned. Here is the seed that Frankenstein came out of. Shelley will go into his life a little bit next week, but Shelley was a mad genius. He was thrown out of Oxford for writing an atheistic pamphlet at 17, and instead of learning his lesson, he eloped with a young woman, and they went to Ireland, and he wrote political pamphlets, and they distributed them on the corners to rabble-rouse and get everything going. He ended up in 1816 fleeing from England for many reasons with his new young wife, Mary Shelley. They were just very young, in their early 20s. He wrote Hymn to Intellectual Beauty when he was with Lord Byron and Mary Shelley and himself staying in Switzerland, and he saw a vision, and the vision came to him as if it were just this: the awful shadow of some unseen power floats through, unseen amongst us, visiting this various world with as inconstant wing as summer winds that creep from flower to flower, like moonbeams that behind some piney mountain shower it visits with inconstant glance, like hues and harmonies of evening, like clouds in starlight, widely spread, like memory of music fled, like aught that for its grace may be dear, and yet dearer for its mystery. He's saying he has a vision of a haunted world. What is haunting this world is an enormous power that, he says later on, love and hope and self-esteem, like clouds, depart and come for some uncertain moments lent, man were immortal and omnipotent, didst thou, unknown and awful as thou art, keep with thy ghost's train firm state within his heart, thou messenger of sympathies that wax and wane in lovers' eyes, thou that to human thought art nourishment like darkness to a dying flame. Depart not as thy shadow came, depart not, lest the grave should be like life in fear, a dark reality. Not just haunted, but haunted to the point of madness. That even death will not cease this, because it is a transcendental madness. It will follow, and he says this, I vowed that I would dedicate my powers to thee and thine. Have I not kept the vow? With beating heart and streaming eyes, even now, I call the phantoms of 1,000 hours, each from his voiceless grave. They have envisioned bowers of studious zeal or love's delight, outwatched with me this envious night. They know that never joy illumined my brow, unlinked with hope that thou wouldst free this world from its dark slavery, that thou, O awful loveliness, would give whatever these words cannot express. And so he set himself up. And in the conversations that came after this came the origins of Frankenstein, Mary Shelley writing it up. And when she had finished writing Frankenstein and was having it published, Shelley was seized again, but this time, instead of it being a conscious vision, was a historically conscious vision, much more powerful, like the Tau state of the electron. And that's when he wrote Prometheus Unbound. And in order to test himself that he was understanding Aeschylus's conscious visionary capacity, he set himself a test. He set himself a test to translate Plato's dialogue, the Symposium, and he translated the whole thing from classical Greece in 10 days. So he gave himself a dry run. Do I understand the mind of Aeschylus at his time perfect enough that I can now write the sequel to it? And that's when he began and wrote Prometheus Unbound. And just to give you a tone of this, he has a spell, a prayer that is at the end of Prometheus Unbound, and we'll come back to it several times. Here it is. To defy power which seems omnipotent, to love and bear, to hope, till hope creates from its own wreck the thing it contemplates. Neither to change, nor falter, nor repent. This, like thy glory, Titan, is to be good, great, and joyous, beautiful, and free. This is alone life, joy, empire, and victory. More next week.